Welcome everyone. I'm very happy to introduce Professor Salim Yaoub, who's our distinguished keynote speaker. The title of his keynote address is Arabs, Americans, and Global 58. So I'm going to read Salim Yaoub's, Professor Yaoub's long bio, and it's not long bio for what he's accomplished in his life, but it's a long bio in the sense of, bear with me for a couple of minutes. So Salim Yaoub was born in 1963 in Sacramento, California, to a Palestinian father and an American mother. At the age of 3, he moved with his family to Beirut, where his parents taught at the American University of Beirut. So welcome back home in a way. After graduating from the American Community School, ACS, in 1981, he returned to the United States and attended the Academy of Art College in San Francisco, California. He received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from that school in 1986, and then spent several years working as a freelance illustrator and graphic designer in the San Francisco area. In the early 1990s, Yaoub decided to return to school to pursue a more academic education. He spent 2 years at San Francisco State University, from which he proceeded to Yale, where he received his PhD in US history in 1999. He then taught for 6 years at the University of Chicago, and since 2005, he's been at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he's now professor of history and directs the Center for Cold War Studies and International History. Yaoub's first book, which we mentioned frequently today in our sessions, is titled Containing Arab Nationalism, the Eisenhower Doctrine and the Middle East. It was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2004. In 2016, Cornell University Press published his second book, Imperfect Strangers, Americans, Arabs, and US Middle East Relations in the 1970s. Yaoub has also authored several articles and book chapters on the history of US foreign relations, the international politics of the Middle East, and Arab-American political activism. He is now writing a post-1945 history of the United States for Cambridge University Press. And what's really important to mark about tonight's keynote address is that it also launches the IFI KZAR series. And on that note, I'd like to welcome Professor Robert Myers, Director of KZAR, the Center for American Studies and Research, to discuss what the series is about and how we're going to inaugurate it tonight. So, Professor Robert.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you for inviting me up here, and thank you so much, Professor Yaoub. We're really quite honored. As Jeffrey said, I'm Robert Myers. I'm the director of the Center for American Studies and Research, and also a professor of English here at AB. This keynote lecture that you're hearing is also, it's a launch, or as my good friend and collaborator Ryan said, is a soft launch for a series that is a joint IFI KZAR, a series called the Policy and Politics in the Americas Lecture and Debate Series. This is one of the collaborative projects that we've engaged in with a number of entities here at AB, but we're so happy to be working with IFI again. It will feature both lectures and debates. The series will bring scholars, diplomats, journalists, policymakers, and public intellectuals to AB in order to expand our understanding of the current political and policy landscape of the Americas. Among other goals, these discussions, and this is part of that series and launching it, is the discussions will seek to illuminate through comparison the political experiences of the United States, of South and Central America, and the Arab world, especially issues related to civil strife, conflict resolution, power sharing, and democracy. So it's hard to imagine a more appropriate launch for the series. Thank you, Salim Yaoub, and thank you very much, Jeffrey, for inviting me up here.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Myers, and thank you, Professor Karam, for your very generous introduction. I want to really thank him for all of the hard work he's put into organizing this event, and also recognize the work of Syrian Crisis, who was, in my experience, just working tirelessly to make this event work, and I'm sure that's the experience of all of the other participants at this event. I know, too, that there are many people working behind the scenes whom I have not met who have worked very hard to make this event possible, so I thank them as well. It's really a wonderful homecoming to be back here in Beirut at AUB, and now taking part in an event at the Issam Faris Institute, and also to help inaugurate the collaborative ventures between the Institute and the Center for American Studies. And it's really wonderful to be back in Beirut after such a long time. The last time I was in Beirut was in the winter of 1982 to 83. And this was shortly after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. There was a great deal of devastation, but also extraordinary vitality. And being back here, I see the same vitality, and at least to my eyes so far, not much evidence of the devastation. Now, this morning, President Fadl al-Khoury, who I can disclose to you as a childhood friend of mine, very kindly greeted me. And he looked at the program and said, are you really going to speak for 2 hours? And I told him, and I can assure you that no, I will not do that. I will speak for 45 to 50 minutes, I think. There may be a little bit of slippage there. And then leave the rest of the time for a conversation among us all. I have titled my talk, Arabs, Americans, and Global 58. My aim is to reflect on the dominant Arab and American outlooks on Middle Eastern and world politics in the late 1950s, and on the ways that those outlooks converged and collided in that crucial year of 1958. Now, Global 58 may not convey the same excitement and cachet as, say, Global 68, but I would argue that 1958 was indeed a pivotal year in international history, and even more so in US-Arab relations. Many patterns of interaction that emerged or first gained prominence in that year would become far more ubiquitous and emblematic in the eras to come. Now, when we talk about the inter-Arab politics of 1958, a key theme is the drive for pan-Arab unity. The most prominent expression of this drive was, of course, the formation of the United Arab Republic, UAR, in February 1958. This event was wildly celebrated, not just in Egypt and Syria, the two nations constituting the UAR, but throughout the Arab world, where many regarded it as the nucleus of a pan-Arab superstate whose consummation was only a matter of time. The unveiling of the UAR was quickly followed, as you know, by the announcement of a separate merger between the Hashemite kingdoms of Iraq and Jordan, the Arab Union. While each union was very much a product of inter-Arab politics, both of them looked outward on a wider world, at least as far as public symbolism was concerned. Gamal Abdel Nasser, who now presided over both Egypt and Syria, was already a figure of global significance, a rising star in the so-called Afro-Asian movement. And so the formation of the UAR was, by association, treated as a major international event. The Arab Union operated in a much narrower sphere, but it too made a grand bid for worldwide significance. The proclamation of the Arab Union drew on the mystique of the Arab Revolt, which Sharif Hussein of the Hejaz, great-grandfather of the current rulers of Iraq and Jordan, Faisal II and Hussein, had launched against the Ottomans during World War I. The revolt, the proclamation stated, quote, was a new dawn for the Arab nation, an attempt to regain the prestige of the Arabs among the nations of the world, and a contribution to the progress of human civilization. And the Arab Union was continuing in this noble tradition. This Proclamation assured its audiences. The supreme irony, of course, was that the drive for Arab unity was overwhelmingly a product of inter-Arab division. The creation of the UAR in early 1958 had everything to do with recent controversies, and worse, between Syria and some of its Arab neighbors. And the formation of the Arab Union was unmistakably a panicky answer to the UAR on the part of Egypt's and Syria's most implacable foes. The Iraqi and Jordanian leaders who enacted the union were desperate to show that they, not Nasser, spoke for the whole Arab nation, and that their claim to Arab leadership rested on much firmer historical foundations than did the pretensions of that upstart in Cairo. Shortly after the unveiling of the Arab Union, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Said scoffed that he had been struggling for Arab independence before Nasser was out of his swaddling clothes, which was literally true. Here he is with Prince Faisal and T.E. Lawrence at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Nasser was 1 year old. But returning to the international theme, by the spring of 1958, the proponents of Arab nationalism could truthfully claim that their challenges had shaken world affairs. The Suez Crisis and War of 1956 afforded the strongest case in point. Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal Company had goaded Britain, France, and Israel into a globally disruptive military attack on Egypt. There wasn't much Nasser could do to prevent the foreign invaders from occupying Egyptian soil, but one thing he could do was close the Suez Canal by sinking block ships loaded down with cement. Meanwhile, Syrian saboteurs, with the connivance of their government, destroyed pipelines carrying Persian Gulf oil across Syrian territory to Mediterranean ports, from which it was to be shipped to Europe. As a result of these actions, Western Europe was almost entirely deprived of Middle Eastern oil. And the ensuing economic crisis played a key role in compelling Britain and France to halt their attack on Egypt and ultimately withdraw their forces. The Israelis took longer to pull their troops out of Sinai and Gaza, but their withdrawal was at least indirectly connected to pressures generated by Nasser's closure of the Suez Canal. The canal did not reopen until April 1957, and only after the great powers had acquiesced in Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. By now, Britain's Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, his Suez policy in shambles, had ignominiously resigned his office. The tripartite attack also prompted Moscow to rise to Cairo's defense, at least on a verbal level, when Soviet Premier Nikolai Bulganin publicly suggested that nuclear missiles might rain down on Britain and France if those two countries persisted in their military operation. On the following day, Britain and France accepted a ceasefire. Historians can debate how decisive the Soviet threat was in achieving this result, but in the Arab world, it was widely credited with forcing an end to the attack. For proponents of Arab nationalism, the message was clear. Their movement was a force to be reckoned with the world over, and those seeking to thwart it did so at their peril. Nor, it seemed, were the costs of opposing Arab nationalism as great as some might suppose. In secretly planning the attack on Egypt, Israeli leaders calculated that President Eisenhower would not dare to restrain them on the eve of the 1956 presidential election. But he did restrain them and was then overwhelmingly returned to office. The events of 1957 provided further evidence that the Arabs had arrived. The Eisenhower Doctrine, which the American president unveiled and the US Congress passed in the early months of that year, was, to be sure, directed at the broader Middle East, but a deep concern over the geopolitical disposition of the Arab world, and especially over the growing influence of President Nasser, lay at the heart of that new policy. The Syrian crisis of the summer and fall of 1957, an event deserving, in my view, far more prominence in Cold War historiography than it currently receives, brought the superpowers dangerously close to military confrontation. When Turkey, a member of NATO, mobilized its forces on the border with Syria, the Soviets again leapt to the defense of an Arab ally. In an interview with an American journalist on October 7th, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev warned the United States that a Turkish attack on Syria would not be tolerated. If war breaks out, he said, we are near Turkey and you are not. When the guns begin to fire, the rockets can begin flying, and then it will be too late to think about it. Khrushchev's threat, coming just 6 weeks after the Soviets had tested the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, and just 3 days after they'd launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, was enthusiastically received throughout the Arab world and widely regarded as providing Syria with an ironclad security guarantee. Again, we can debate how consequential the Soviets' verbal intervention was, but appearances count for a lot in international affairs. As in the case of Suez, many Arab nationalists emerged from the crisis convinced that they had friends in high places who would always be willing to lend a hand. In December 1957, just weeks after the conclusion of the Syrian crisis, Cairo hosted the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference. This was the second major gathering of emerging third world nations to be held after the Bandung Conference of 1955. 45 African, Asian, and Middle Eastern countries sent delegates to Cairo, nearly twice as many as in 1955. The tenor of the conference was a good deal more critical of Western nations and their Cold War policies than 2 years earlier, reflecting in large part the impact of the Suez crisis and the more recent Syrian crisis. The Cairo conference was also notable for being the first of its kind to feature representatives of women's organizations, not just in the audience, but at the podium as well. The fact that Cairo was hosting the event placed Egypt and Nasser personally at the forefront of the gathering of third world solidarity movement. In his 1954 manifesto, The Philosophy of the Revolution, Nasser had famously proclaimed that Egypt would play a central role in 3 overlapping circles: the Arab circle, the African circle, and the Islamic circle. With his forays into Afro-Asian solidarity, he showed he was transcending even this ambitious prediction and gaining prominence in a 4th Asian circle. From there, it was but a short step to attaining truly global reach. The international prominence of the Afro-Asian bloc, which soon dovetailed with the rising non-aligned movement, would dramatically expand over the next several years, hand in hand with an acceleration in the decolonization process and in the emergence of many newly independent nations, especially in Africa. Now, one African nation then seeking independence, operating very much within the Arab and Islamic circles as well, was, of course, Algeria. Lasting from 1954 to 1962, the Algerian struggle for independence was one of the great global dramas of the era. Our fellow conferee, Sylvie Tenot, astutely questions the prevailing view that 1958 was a turning point for the Algerian Revolution. It was a turning point for France, she allows, but not necessarily for Algeria. But Sylvie does persuasively show, as does Sofia Papastancou, that 1958 was the year in which the internationalization of the struggle, already underway for some time, took a quantum leap. Early that year, France's bloody attack on the Tunisian town of Sakiet Seydi Youssef brought a torrent of international condemnation down on France, prompting Britain and the United States to intervene as mediators in the resulting Franco-Tunisian dispute. And in May, of course, a coup by right-wing French officers in Algiers set in motion a chain of events leading to the fall of the Fourth Republic and the return to power of Charles de Gaulle. In September 1958, a provisional Algerian government in exile, the GPRA, established itself in Cairo. It won recognition from every independent Arab country, except Lebanon, and opened offices in capitals throughout the world. Matthew Connolly and other scholars have shown that the Algerians won their independence primarily through actions taken outside their own country. In 1958, this process gathered critical momentum. The point I'm making is a simple and general one. By 1958, the struggles and challenges associated with Arab nationalism were impinging on, and in some cases forcefully shaking, the global order. This was clear from even the most cursory glance at international headlines, and it was something in which Arabs of virtually all persuasions and walks of life could and did take some pride. All that said, one didn't have to dig too far below the assertive and confident Arab surface to find deep fissures of disagreement and turbulent currents of anxiety. The proclamation of the UAR in February 1958 was an occasion for public rejoicing throughout the Arab world. But in some regions, it was greeted with consternation or even dread. Iraqi leaders were terrified at the prospect of Nasser gaining control over the pipelines carrying Iraqi oil across Syrian territory, and thus acquiring the ability to wreak havoc on Iraq's economy. The country had already gotten a taste of that sort of difficulty when its pipelines were severed during the Suez War. More broadly, Iraqi leaders were sure that Nasser would not be content with his acquisition of Syria, but would redouble his efforts to undermine the Baghdad regime. Iraq's leaders expressed their apprehension through a strange combination of fatalism and aggressiveness. In March, a British diplomat reported that after visiting Baghdad, he had found Iraqi leaders in a very jittery state and acting as though they expected to be gone in 6 months. An all too accurate prediction, it turned out. Yet the old regime was not about to surrender without a fight. Repeatedly in the spring of 1958, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Said and Crown Prince Abdullah urged the US and British governments to support Iraqi subversive or military efforts against neighboring Syria for the purpose of detaching it from the UAR and drawing it into Iraq's orbit instead. Rather than succumb, the Crown Prince remarked to a British diplomat, it would be better for the Hashemites to go down fighting honorably. The political crisis here in Lebanon, which erupted in civil war in May 1958, was a further source of anxiety in Baghdad. Iraqi leaders were desperate for Camille Chamoun to prevail in his struggle against his domestic opponents. They saw Lebanon's president as a key ally in their common battle against the UAR. If Chamoun exited the scene, their own situation would grow vastly more perilous. In June, Abdullah met in Istanbul with the US Consul General to report on his contacts with Syrian exiles in that city. The exiles, he said, believed that a diversionary, revolutionary movement should be started in northern Syria to take UAR pressure off of Lebanon. The Crown Prince urged the United States to provide logistical support to this revolutionary movement. But Washington declined to do so on the grounds that the effort stood no chance of success. And I should say that Robert McNamara's paper goes into some detail on the various subversive schemes that Iraqi leaders were urging the United States and Britain to support at this time. And it's really quite remarkable just how aggressive and in some cases grandiose they were. I mean, they wanted to have an Arab Union military operation land in Lebanon to rescue Chamoun with air support from the United States. As we saw in Robert McNamara's paper, there was talk of annexing Kuwait. So really, they're wildly attempting to expand their own sphere of influence in an effort ultimately to save themselves. A failed effort, of course. It is both eerie and poignant to witness how apprehensive Iraqi leaders were in the months, weeks, and days leading up to the Iraqi Revolution of July 1958, an upheaval that brought about their personal demise. But it's also striking to note how consistently their efforts were directed outward, beyond Iraq's borders, rather than toward the Iraqi officer corps, where the danger actually resided. Our kind and gracious host, Jeffrey Cuddam, has produced some outstanding scholarship to illuminate this striking failure of perception within the Baghdad regime, and also among the US officials who engaged with that regime. Nasser and his allies had, of course, a much better 1958 than did their conservative Arab adversaries. Still, there were nagging anxieties eating away at leaders in the progressive camp too, though nothing like those besetting top officials in Baghdad. Relations with Moscow were a case in point. Publicly, in the months following the Suez War, Nasser and other Arab nationalist leaders had heaped praise on the Soviet Union for its staunch support for Egypt during that crisis. Within his own inner circle, however, Nasser sometimes grumbled that the Soviets had allowed the tripartite attack to unfold for well over a week before issuing their dramatic threats against Britain and France. Nasser suspected that the gesture was an act of opportunism rather than solidarity, that the Soviets could see that the attackers would soon be forced to desist anyway and wanted to make that outcome appear to be the consequence of Moscow's intervention. For more than 2 years following the Suez War, Nasser kept quiet about this suspicion. He finally went public with it in the spring of 1959 during his bitter feud with Nikita Khrushchev over the geopolitical disposition of Iraq. Nasser was also keenly disappointed in the Soviet response to the Anglo-US interventions of July 1958. During a hastily arranged trip to Moscow immediately after the military operations began, he urged Khrushchev to issue a public statement warning that the Soviet Union would come to the defense of Iraq or Syria if either nation was subject to Western intervention. Khrushchev declined, warning that such a move could bring about global war. There is no politician in the world, Khrushchev said, who can have it on his conscience that he exposed his people to the horrors of a nuclear war. The confrontation is political, not military, and it need not become military. Khrushchev's cautious response not only confirmed Nasser's suspicion that when it came to Soviet pledges of solidarity, there was perhaps less than met the eye. Another notable development of 1958 was the emergence of potent challenges to Nasser's leadership from within the progressive camp. At first glance, the Iraqi leaders who seized power in July appeared to be acolytes of Nasser, and some of them were. But the figure ultimately prevailing in the struggle for power in Iraq, General Abdul Karim Qasim, soon revealed himself to be a bitter rival of Nasser. Qasim forcefully opposed any talk of bringing Iraq into the UAR and violently cracked down on Iraqi Nasserists. As the political scientist Malcolm Kerr, and former president of this university, observed in his classic book, The Arab Cold War, had Qasim been just another reactionary like King Hussein or Nur Said, he would have posed no serious threat to Nasser's moral prestige, and the line of counterattack would have been clear and familiar. But of course, he was no reactionary. He was a flaming radical, a hero of the slum dwellers of Baghdad, the enemy of Nasser's presumed imperialist enemies, and a friend of Nasser's presumed friend, the Soviet Union. In short, Qasim threatened not simply to stand in Nasser's way, but to supplant him as a rival claimant to progressive Arab leadership. Over the next several years, the inter-Arab struggle for regional preeminence would enter a new phase, one in which the familiar contest between radical and conservative camps would be overlain by a separate rivalry within the radical camp. 1958 was the year in which this more complicated inter-Arab system took shape. There is, of course, much more I could say about Arab outlooks in 1958, but in the interest of time, I will now shift gears to talk about how things looked from the United States, both to officials in Washington and to observers from broader sectors of American society. For the Eisenhower administration, the upheaval in the Arab world was an important and especially challenging manifestation of the dramatic changes that the international system as a whole had undergone since the early 1950s. And some of what I'm about to say will focus on events outside the Middle East, but their relevance to the Middle East will, I hope, be clear. Since Joseph Stalin's death in 1953, the US-Soviet rivalry had grown less hostile in some ways and more vigorous and dynamic in others. Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, had abandoned Stalin's professed belief in the inevitability of armed conflict between communism and capitalism, and had instead adopted a posture of peaceful competition. A key arena in which Moscow now competed with Washington was the effort to win friends among emerging third world nations. The United States wished to thwart this Soviet initiative, but it was hindered by its own alliances with imperialist European powers. The US struggle for influence in the Middle East was, of course, emblematic of this new international pattern. In the early aftermath of the Suez War, the Eisenhower administration believed it had significantly improved its own diplomatic position, both among Arab nations and in the broader third world, by so forcefully and successfully opposing the tripartite attack on Egypt. The unveiling of the Eisenhower Doctrine in early 1957 was partly an expression of this newfound confidence. But subsequent events in the Middle East and elsewhere caused US officials to fear that they were losing the diplomatic initiative. In the Syrian crisis I discussed earlier, the United States utterly failed to orchestrate a pan-Arab campaign to oust the left-leaning Damascus regime. And in the process of attempting this, came close to triggering a dangerous superpower confrontation. The Syrian crisis coincided with two other events that deeply embarrassed the United States overseas. The Little Rock affair of September 1957, in which Eisenhower was obliged to send federal troops into the state of Arkansas to enable 9 African-American teenagers to attend an all-white public high school amid the jeers and taunts of a hostile white mob, and the launching of Sputnik, which showed that the United States had fallen behind the Soviet Union in the space race. Meanwhile, and partly as a consequence of these developments, the tenor of international politics was growing increasingly critical of the United States. Across the Afro-Asian nations, governments, newspapers, political opposition groups, and other shapers of public opinion became ever more vocal in castigating America's arrogant behavior abroad and its racist practices at home. A similar phenomenon was emerging in Latin America, where a number of countries were undergoing populist or leftist upheavals that challenged the authority of entrenched oligarchs, often with close ties to Washington. In May 1958, Vice President Richard Nixon took a goodwill tour of South American countries, where his visits were marred by hostile demonstrations. Protesters in Caracas, Venezuela, nearly dragged Nixon and his entourage out of their cars. Venezuela, I guess we've come full circle on that one. So why was the United States flailing in the third world? Many Eisenhower administration officials maintained that communist agitators were whipping up anti-American sentiment. Back home from his turbulent trip to South America, Nixon reported to the cabinet that the ringleaders of the protests, without any doubt, were communists. The similarity in slogans, placards, and tactics from one city to the next, he said, was absolute proof that the demonstrators were directed and controlled by a central communist conspiracy. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles agreed, bemoaning the susceptibility of the lower classes to get demagogic appeals that could only result in a communist-led dictatorship of the masses. But Foster's brother, Allen Dulles, director of the CIA, disputed this assessment, insisting that Latin Americans had genuine grievances and that there would be trouble in Latin America even if there were no communists. The Eisenhower administration's liberal opponents lodged a more forceful dissent. Now, this was a fascinating moment in American political history when, on a host of foreign policy questions, Democrats attacked the Eisenhower administration from both the left and the right. And this is a Time magazine cover of a bunch of senators and other prominent Democrats who were hoping to run for president in 1960. Obviously, John F. Kennedy is among them. So the Democrats are attacking the Eisenhower administration from both the left and the right on foreign policy. On the one hand, they charged that the administration had fallen behind in the space race and had allowed a dangerous missile gap in Moscow's favor to open up. On the other hand, they alleged that Eisenhower and his advisors, whether out of complacency, laziness, or racial and cultural prejudice, had neglected the needs and aspirations of non-white nations, which, consequently, were turning away from the United States and growing ever more susceptible to communist appeals. Sharply voicing this critique was the 1958 novel The Ugly American by William Lederer and Eugene Burdick. The book was an instant bestseller, widely read by members of the American political elite, especially Democrats. Senator John F. Kennedy arranged to have a copy of the book sent to all of his Senate colleagues. The novel unfolds in the imaginary Southeast Asian nation of Sarkhan, which is menaced by a communist insurgency backed by Russia and Red China. The insurgency makes rapid progress, largely because the American diplomats in the country are clueless dilettantes, more interested in attending cocktail parties and shopping at the commissary than in learning about Sarkhan and its people. They cannot speak Sarkhanese and are disdainful of the nation's customs. Soviet and Chinese diplomats, by contrast, display no such flaws and relentlessly draw Sarkhan into their sinister orbit. The novel's message was clear. If the United States was to prevail in the Cold War, it would have to become much more serious about winning over the non-white world. American diplomats and aid workers would have to roll up their sleeves, get up off their soft behinds, and trek out to the countryside to work with native populations, not on grandiose projects like suspension bridges and hydroelectric dams, but in tiny village industries that made an immediate difference in people's lives. Americans abroad must learn local languages and willingly live among the natives as equals, not superiors. The Ugly American was not high literature. Its tone was preachy and its characters flat. But it vividly expressed the dissatisfaction and malaise animating American liberalism in the late 1950s, a feeling that the United States had grown soft in its prosperity and arrogant in its power, and must somehow recapture the spirit of mission, sacrifice, and egalitarianism that had made it a great nation in the first place. So within the Democratic Party, and especially its more liberal wing, there was a strong inclination to sympathize with the strivings of third world peoples for greater independence and dignity. And at least in a generic sense, this favorable attitude was extended to people in the Arab world. But the picture was complicated, of course, by the Arab-Israeli conflict and by the overwhelming tendency of Democrats to side with Israel in that dispute. For this reason, Arab nationalists stood a better chance of receiving a fair hearing in American liberal circles when their struggles took them outside of the Arab-Israeli arena. A case in point was a 1957 speech delivered by a young Democratic senator from Massachusetts named John F. Kennedy, strongly criticizing French policy toward Algeria and calling for negotiations between the parties leading ultimately to Algerian independence. This was a bold move on Kennedy's part, but not a politically suicidal one, because the Arab cause he championed was pitted against France rather than Israel. In a somewhat similar way, you see this sort of attitude unfolding among African Americans, especially mainstream African American leaders like Martin Luther King. They were very strongly pro-Israel, but also intrigued by Nasser, And it was Nasser's role as a broader third world leader, not his role in the Arab-Israeli conflict, that they pointed to with some measure of admiration. Now, turning to how the Eisenhower administration navigated these issues in its approach to the Arab world of 1958, the upheavals in Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq offer the most vivid impressions. As administration officials grappled with those crises, the specter of mob violence, whether fomented by Nasser, by unnamed communist agitators, or by some combination of the two, figured extremely prominently in their deliberations. This focus is not surprising. After all, Nixon's ordeal in Caracas was just weeks in the past, and the street demonstrations shaking Beirut and other Arab capitals as spring turned to summer, not to mention the wild street scenes in Baghdad following the overthrow of the Iraqi regime, looked all too familiar to US officials. Cabling Washington in mid-June, the US Embassy in Beirut worried about the ability of security forces to contain the Muslim mob. On July 11th, the US Embassy in Amman predicted that internal disturbances brought on by the UAR could take the form of extremist nationalist demonstrations and mob disturbances. On July 14th, as Eisenhower and his advisors contemplated military action in Lebanon in the immediate aftermath of the Iraqi coup and in the wake of Shamoun's plea for Western intervention, Vice President Nixon warned of mob violence against American embassies and Americans throughout the whole Middle East. In a way, this is our greatest risk. As I said, it is not surprising that US officials would stress the volatile nature of what a later generation would call the Arab street. But clearly they exaggerated the destructive power of public disorder. As with Iraqi leaders in the weeks preceding the Baghdad coup, one is struck by the deep fatalism with which the Eisenhower administration contemplated its geopolitical options in the region. In assessing how to respond to Shamoun's request for US intervention, whether during the mid-June deliberations or in the aftermath of the Iraqi coup a month later, Secretary of State Dulles lamented that the United States would be damned if it did and damned if it didn't. If Washington ignored Shamoun's cry for help, Shamoun and other pro-Western leaders would be easy pickings for leftist insurgents. If the United States did go into Lebanon, a region-wide wave of angry protests, buttressed by hostile official acts, such as the closure of the Suez Canal and the severing of the Syrian pipelines, would sweep conservative Arab regimes from power. The present governments of the Arab states will go down the drain whether we go in or not, Dulles said. It would just be a matter of timing. As we all know, Eisenhower concluded that the risks of inaction were greater than the risks of action, and he quickly sent US forces to Lebanon. Yet the president was deeply apprehensive about the decision. "We are opening a Pandora's box," he told British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan on the eve of the operation. "We don't know what's at the bottom of it." Actually, the consequences proved far less dire for the United States than Eisenhower and his advisors had feared. The US intervention in Lebanon, along with the British action in Jordan, provoked harsh responses and menacing gestures, but little in the way of tangible opposition. Nasser, who was then in Yugoslavia, denounced the Anglo-US operations and vowed to defend Iraq too if it was invaded, or to Iraq if it too was invaded. The Syrian sector of the UAR went on high alert, canceling army leaves and busing armed civilians to the border with Lebanon, but the Suez Canal stayed open, the pipelines in Syria remained intact, and oil installations elsewhere in the area were undisturbed. The remaining pro-Western regimes were not, as Secretary Dulles had predicted, swept away in an irresistible tide of popular anger. But even if disaster was averted, Eisenhower recognized that the US position vis-a-vis Arab nationalism was broadly unsustainable. The trouble, he told Nixon on the morning of July 15th, just as the US Marines started wading ashore at Khaldi,
is that we have a campaign of hatred against us, not by the Arab governments, but by the people. The people are on Nasser's side. 2 weeks later, Eisenhower remarked at an NSC meeting, since we're about to get thrown out of the area, we might as well believe in Arab nationalism. Such a conversion became easier to stomach in early 1959, when tensions unexpectedly arose between Nasser and the Soviet Union. The dispute resulted from the Soviet support for the new Iraqi government under Abdul Karim Qasim, which had allied itself with the Iraqi Communist Party in a domestic power struggle with Iraqi Nasserists. As Cairo and Moscow waged a nasty war of words, US officials came to appreciate that Nasserism could function as a barrier to, rather than an avenue of, Soviet encroachment on the region. The result was a modest rapprochement between the United States and the UAR, lasting for the remainder of Eisenhower's term and into that of his successor. And Dina Rizik's paper very nicely goes into the details of this. I'm really sorry that we weren't able to hear her better today, but her article, when it is published, will be very illuminating on this point. There is more I could say about, I'll just make one additional point before I wrap up, which is that what the Eisenhower administration belatedly came to see was that often, and indeed usually, it could get a much better result if it refrained from taking action, and which tended to be counterproductive, but rather withdrew and allowed events in the region to unfold. And when that happened, things generally shook out in ways that were more beneficial to the United States than happened when the United States intervened. And once again, the CIA director, Alan Dulles, had a somewhat clearer insight into the meaning of these so-called Arab mobs. He said at an NSC meeting in July 31st, 1958, the mobs in the streets in the Near East today are shouting for one big Arab state. And many Arab countries give lip service to close relations with Nasser, but when it comes to dividing up oil revenues or the waters of the Nile, it is a different story. And indeed, already clear fissures were opening up between Egypt and Iraq, not just over the question of Iraq's relationship to the UAR, but also over Egypt's desire for Iraq to share some of its oil resources, which the new Iraqi leaders were not interested in doing. There is, of course, much more that one could say about key transformations occurring in that pivotal year of 1958. For example, the Arab-Israeli dimension, both in terms of US relations with Israel and with respect to militant stirrings on the Palestinian side, changed in subtle and profound ways during that year. But you have indulged me long enough, and it's time for others to weigh in. So I will end my unilateral intervention, open the floor to questions and comments, and look forward to continuing this investigation as a shared enterprise. Thank you very much.
So floor is open for comments, questions. Yeah, sure. Michael?
Salim, thank you for this very interesting lecture you gave us. I have a question, if I could ask you on your last point. You know, a book came out a few years ago called Ike's Gamble, written by Mike Duran. He makes an argument that the Eisenhower administration, initially was much more open to Arab nationalism, but then became disillusioned with this and effectively lost the gamble. And Duran's argument is that ultimately the US shifted towards Israel, seeing it as a more reliable partner. What's your assessment of this? You didn't really get into the relationship with Israel. You just closed on that. Maybe could I ask you just a bit to develop that and to see if this argument is a correct one or an incorrect one? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there is a lot to it. I mean, the valence, the moral valence that Duran puts on it is different from the one that I would put on it. But I think in terms of analysis, there's a lot to it. Essentially, what this experience in 1957 and 58, the Eisenhower Doctrine years, had imparted to U.S. officials was the difficulty of relying on Arab allies. Now, there was an earlier phase when they had hopes in Nasser, a subsequent phase from 56 to 58, when there was a very vigorous attempt to cultivate alliances with conservative Arab regimes, and for various reasons that we have discussed already in other panels, that strategy was shown to be quite faulty by the summer of 1958. And in that context, the Eisenhower administration did start slowly and modestly reassessing its relationship with Israel. And part of it was looking anew at the likely consequences of Israeli military actions against neighboring Arab countries. Now, for the sort of conventional wisdom or the default assumption among most Eisenhower administration officials up until this point was that Israeli military action of almost any kind was a liability for the United States. It would cause all kinds of diplomatic complications in the Arab world, and it was to be discouraged. Now, what happens in 1958, is that better? Sorry, I'm sorry if I was speaking too quietly earlier. What happened in 1958 was that the Eisenhower administration started looking at, in particular, looking at the situation in Jordan, and I'm sure Clea Hupp will be able to illuminate this for us tomorrow. And there was this fear, or this scenario, where imagine that King Hussein falls from power, and whether at Nasser's instigation or independently, and an Arab nationalist regime takes power in Amman. The assumption was that the Israelis would move in and to take the West Bank. Now, this scenario, this likelihood of how the Israelis might react to the fall of King Hussein's government was something that Nasser himself was increasingly commenting on as 1958 wore on. Nasser himself would say, well, one danger if King Hussein falls is that the Israelis might take the West Bank. And in the eyes of Eisenhower administration officials, this started to look to be a good thing. Well, maybe it's not such a bad idea that Nasser is afraid of how the Israelis might react, because that would cause him to urge restraint on his allies in Jordan. So that kind of thinking slowly and subtly starts to gain traction in 1958. And it takes some years for it to crystallize in a closer U.S.-Israeli relationship, but I would argue that 1958 is the year when that shift begins. So that was one thing I meant when I said that there's an important U.S.-Israeli story to tell about the significance of 1958.
Other questions or comments? Robert.
Thank you. Wonderful paper, very enlightening. One thing that's interesting about 1958, well, it's really 1959, but it's the fallout from the 1958 crisis, is that the Middle East almost disappears from the map of world conflict for a greater part of the 1960s until the 1967 war. Okay, there's a civil war in Yemen from the autumn of 1962, but that's really a bit of a sideshow to a large extent, and doesn't have the same traction that the period from really the formation of the Baghdad Pact, the Czech arms deal, through to the Suez, through to the fall of the Iraqi monarchy in 1958 has, and in a sense, the Middle East disappears off the agenda as being a major kind of factor in the wider international system and in the Cold War. I was wondering, well, would you agree with that kind of point to an extent?
Yeah, I would. I would say that in general, if you look at the broad, especially the broad Cold War rivalry, there does seem to be not a mutual agreement, maybe a tacit understanding between the superpowers not to push each other too hard in that area. And then the arena of conflict shifts to Cuba, Berlin, and Southeast Asia. And I think what you also see, which is interesting, is that each superpower tries to mend fences with Middle Eastern countries that it had previously shunned. So this is the era, at least if we're talking about the early 60s, when the Kennedy administration does make a pretty serious effort to improve relations with the UAR, to be sure, but also with Iraq. And then after the breakup of the UAR, there is still on Kennedy's part an effort to maintain tolerable relations with Syria. And that all, I mean, the Yemen Civil War, beginning in the fall of '62, in all sorts of direct and indirect ways, undermines that effort. So by the time of Kennedy's assassination, his effort to cultivate better relations with Nasser and other Arab nationalists had been seriously undermined, and likely would have come to an end, or at least been very significantly dialed back, even if he had lived. But then he is assassinated. Lyndon Johnson comes in, and he has no interest whatsoever, as far as I can tell, in maintaining those relationships, and so that they just take a nosedive. And similarly, the Soviet Union in this period is improving relations with Iran and with Turkey, countries that previously it had very poor relations with. So that is something, and I don't have a very strong explanation for why that occurs, but it definitely does occur in the first half of the 1960s.
Yeah, I was just struck, if you read Waging Peace, the volume of Eisenhower's memoirs, the Middle East features very, very strongly in it. But if you read some of the early kind of biographies of John F. Kennedy, Sorensen, and Schlesinger, I think there's one page on the Middle East between the two of them. It's quite extraordinary how off the radar of being a major issue it is to the Kennedy, or at least the people who were close to Kennedy at that point.
And the fact that the outbreak of the Yemeni Civil War more or less coincided with the Cuban Missile Crisis, it drives it even farther away from.
And that was a very slow-burning crisis as well, the Yemeni Civil War. It takes a long time for its effects to really, it looks like something that can be managed without necessarily damaging U.S.-Egyptian relations at the time as well, I think. In some ways, they see it as an opportunity to kind of show we're an honest broker in our dealings with Egypt vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia.
And they supported the coup in Iraq against Abdul Karim Qasim to show that sign of faith in '63. Kennedy authorized the CIA to support that operation at that point as part of sort of that Middle Eastern rapprochement with Egypt.
Well, how much do we actually know about that?
Yeah, that's
I
a
mean,
bit. That's a wide rumor, but I'm not sure is it actually.
Has the smoking gun memo surfaced?
The intelligence bulletins that came out a year ago show it on the top of the agenda on that day. So I would assume that at least the president knew about it a couple of days. It was the #1 item on that morning in February of 1963.
Okay.
So we're assumed that there might be some smoking gun.
But there's a 9-hour time difference between Baghdad and never mind.
And DC, yeah. President Khouri has a question as well.
So I'm out of my league on this subject, but it seems, when you read the history of the U.S.'s intervention in Iran, which predates this, and the previous attempts by British leaders, including Churchill and others in Eden, to get Truman into it, which were rebuffed, you see I hate to use the phrase, the slippery slope of the domino principle that, the dominant personality in many ways in the American foreign policy under Eisenhower, which was John Foster Dulles. And in this case, actually, his brother agreed with him, at least,
Yes.
right? begin to unfold. And 58 was a year where Lebanon, which turned out to be a much less exciting adventure than they had feared, builds, at least the way I grew up thinking of it, and this may be urban legend, into the far more fateful decision that Eisenhower took, and then Kennedy, who also was a believer in the domino theory,
Yes.
engage in Vietnam on a far greater scale. But you see this as what was happening in the, do you see what happened in 58 with growing American anxiety that's been documented in the Middle East, and at least initially their fears before the sort of contretemps between Khrushchev and Nasser, as this fear of more and more countries of some interest at least sliding into the Soviet sphere, leading to the mistakes that the US would subsequently undertake in Vietnam and in Cuba, as they increasingly thought, well, this person's against me, so whether it's Bay of Pigs or what happened in Vietnam, that's where at least some historians seem to think there's some momentum.
Yes, absolutely. And one needs to approach this with some subtlety in talking about how the United States viewed the Arab nationalist movement. It wasn't such a simplistic worldview in which Arab nationalism and communism are equated and is seen as having no difference between them at all. U.S. officials understood the distinction between the two. What they feared, however, was that Arab nationalists themselves were not sufficiently cognizant to the Soviet threat. That they thought they were naive, that they assumed that they could invite Soviet aid and advisors into their countries and would not realize the insidious threat to their own independence that those kinds of overtures represented. So that was the way they tended to frame the threat that Nasser posed. And so that was why, when he turned so decisively against the Soviet Union in 1959, although we should also not read too much into that, because the relationship was between Cairo and Moscow was subsequently patched up pretty nicely. But nonetheless, when that happened, it really was quite a revelation to U.S. officials, because it wasn't that they thought Nasser was a communist, that they thought he was naive about communism, and in that instance at least, he showed that he had some ability to recognize the threat that communism posed, or that Soviet influence posed to the Arab world. I would just say that in a broader sense, there is a continuum of engaging in policies that, in retrospect, we can go back and look at and see them as quite reckless and dangerous, but made sense to U.S. officials at the time, because they really did see the necessity of performing a kind of containment in various parts of the world. And they were also, and this subject came up quite strongly in a previous panel, they really did buy this idea of credibility, that there was this real fear that if an ally of the United States, especially a very weak and vulnerable ally like Lebanon, called for help, and the United States ignored that call, the assumption was that this would be devastating to U.S. prestige, that other countries that were relying on the United States would cease to do so, and if not turn to the Soviet Union, then adopt more neutralist policies. So I think that assumption about the importance of credibility, it does go all the way back to the early years of the Cold War. It persists through this period and is not really dented by the kinds of setbacks that occurred. And really, it wasn't until Vietnam that the cost of a total reliance on the credibility theory became evident. And you get a somewhat more subtle notion of what credibility entails. I mean, is it maybe you're enhancing your credibility by showing that you can behave with restraint, that you can refrain from an orgy of violence. Maybe that will generate more credibility in the long run. But that kind of insight was some years in the future.
So Salim, I have a question. So when we think of the new chapter in U.S.-Arab relations after Suez, that moment of American popularity, the idea that they came to Egypt's support, then we fast forward a couple of months down the fact to 58, and there's a new chapter in U.S.-Arab relations. But the idea is that that comes at a cost where we don't see, and this is Cyrus's argument in the Ijma's piece on reconsidering 1958, which is the post-colonial Arab state system never really materialized. So how do you reconcile two worlds when it comes to better U.S.-Arab relations, at least until the Eisenhower administration's second term ends into the Kennedy administration, but also the fact that it became easier to deal with authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, mostly military-based. So should we assume that the better U.S.-Arab relations did in fact lead to a decrease in a better consolidation of the post-colonial moment in the late 50s, early 60s, and then we saw that become more entrenched with the coup in Iraq in 63, then in the 70s in Syria, and the list goes on to where we saw propping up of military-based regimes. Should we blame it on 58 and blame it on the idea of a new phase, a new short-lived honeymoon between the Eisenhower administration and the Arabs, or is it a faulty assumption?
I mean, I would blame it on a couple things if we want to use the language of blame. I mean, it is what you suggest, the idea that the United States was eager to throw its support behind authoritarian regimes if those regimes behaved in ways that served what officials in Washington regarded as U.S. interests, and the relationship with the royal families of the Persian Gulf and other authoritarian regimes in the region. That's emblematic of the point that you have made. But I think another key ingredient in this political tragedy is the Arab-Israeli conflict. Because basically what the Arab-Israeli conflict did was create a widespread view in the Arab world that the Arab world was in a state of emergency. And this becomes even more, this perception becomes even more acute after 1967. And it becomes all too easy for authoritarian regimes in the Arab world of every ideological stripe to essentially argue that democracy, civil liberties, these are luxuries that we cannot afford right now while we are under this kind of threat. Once this threat has been dealt with, then we can talk about opening up our society, but not until then. And of course, this state of emergency has never lifted. So I would very strongly underscore the impact of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and especially really the psychological impact, more than its physical manifestations, although for the countries surrounding Israel, the physical impact has been very grave. But throughout the broader region, I think the psychological impact has been really quite crippling politically.
Thank you for a great talk. I'm wondering about the oil factor, not in the sense of the country's supplies of oil, but what did the actual oil corporations do? What was their position, and how did they try to lobby the American government this way or that way, or the British government for that matter?
Okay, well, this is a subject on which Nate Satino is far more expert than I, and I'm sure there are many others in this room more expert than I. The role of the oil companies is really quite extensive. It's playing a major part in the establishment of the infrastructure of many Gulf Arab states, most prominently Saudi Arabia. Now, there is an interesting role that the oil companies eventually, well, they played it all along, but it becomes somewhat more prominent in later years, which in a way kind of was to mitigate, or at least attempt to mitigate, the impact of the pro-Israel lobby. And so this is a fascinating chapter that emerges, especially after 1967, where the oil companies, pretty much entirely out of self-interest, are arguing that as long as the Israeli occupation continues, the more our holdings in the region will be threatened. So out of that perception, you do see the lobbying efforts on the part of Aramco and other oil companies on the various U.S. administrations to adopt a more even-handed policy towards the Arab-Israeli conflict. And for this, they got a huge amount of grief in the mid to late 1970s. And that's sort of this interesting moment in American politics where what you see is basically the agenda of the pro-Israel lobby making a loose coalition with progressive elements of U.S. society. And the argument is that these corporations they've commanded control of Washington, they're telling our government what to do, and they're aligning themselves with these authoritarian Arab governments for their own material gain, and they're doing so at the expense of democratic Israel. And so you see this kind of interesting coalition emerging where the oil companies are painted as bad guys because they're they're anti-Israel and they're greedy corporate predators. I mean, there's more that one could say about the role of oil companies, but
I was wondering about this Irene Genzier 48 role. Has that still
yes,
been
sure.
through the 50s? Or?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
Irene Genzier has written this book on
yes.
the oil companies in 48,
Yes.
which revises the kind of view that they were 100% pro-Arab because of their interests, and they seem to be quite happy to work with the
Yeah,
so did that filter through during the 50s? That was what I was trying to get at.
Well, I would argue that they tend to be pragmatic. And so once they've lost a battle, they will often adjust to the new reality. And that's definitely what happened in 1948. And a similar thing on the part of the so-called Arabists in the State Department.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I actually also had a question related to oil, but I was kind of going off the quote that you ended your talk with about Egypt sort of being frustrated that Iraq didn't want to share its oil revenues. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the role of oil in sort of Arab nationalism and how that might have played a role in maybe dividing the different Arab, sort of those that had oil from those that did not.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we're going to collect
Let's
a few more
collect
questions.
two. I saw two hands here. I think, Melanie, you have something to say, right? And Nate also. Great. So go ahead, and then Nate, the floor is yours.
May I be permitted 2 questions? Is that all right? I'll make them fast.
There's a limit on 2. After 2, we can't take
Great,
any more
perfect.
questions. I'm joking.
The more bulky of the questions is I'm reading Lebanese press right now, specifically covering the period May through July 1958. And there's something that's coming through is a huge sense of uncertainty on a day-to-day basis. Just there's the rule that has been thrown out. Is sort of, no matter what sort of political ideology that particular newspaper, but the coverage of day-to-day surprises and uncertainty is sort of poignant there. And then reading in particular the American sources, and then as well as the larger picture of American foreign policy in the 50s, there seems to be that flip side of uncertainty, which is invincibility, in that if you are the one being acted upon, then there's just huge amounts of uncertainty. If you're the one doing the action, whether that's covert, funding elections, et cetera, whatever American foreign policy tool of that any given day is, there's a sense of invincibility in that there is no rule book. So on both sides, there's what I think is a sense of anything goes. And I'm wondering if you would have a take on that when it comes to sort of evaluating the revolutionary nature of 1958. Might that be a moment when that was brought to a screeching halt, this sense of invincibility or a sense of sort of newly independent states like Lebanon, who's only had political independence for about a decade, in that when you say this something is not constitutional, it doesn't have a lot of weight because the Constitution's only been in place there's only been one president, 2 presidents at this point. And so I'm not articulating this very well, but if you could comment on the sense of uncertainty and invincibility that is intermingling in the moment of 1958, that would be interesting.
Just to clarify,
where's the notion of invincibility is coming from where?
So the U.S. has orchestrated a successful coup in 1951 in Iran. The U.S. has structured or facilitated the electoral outcomes in Lebanon in 1957. There seems the sense of if the U.S. foreign policy establishment wants to make it happen, it can. It can throw money at something. It can throw covert CIA operatives at something. It can intervene militarily, even though it wants to perhaps restrain.
But just to clarify, so this notion that the United States is invincible, that's coming also from the Lebanese press?
No, sorry. I'm putting these two things together.
So who is engaging in the rhetoric of invincibility?
That is my guess.
Who?
No
Who?
one. Oh,
No
the,
one. You said where'd you get this notion from? Who's saying it?
all of the collective American activities in the 1950s point towards a sense of we can do what we want to do.
Okay.
We can engender the outcome that we want to engender. And so that's my invincibility.
Got it.
And then the flip side of invincibility being extreme uncertainty and throwing out the rule book.
Okay, got it.
And then a second, smaller question, I promise, is a brief overview of the Palestinian publications. I went to the Palestinian Studies Institute, and I wanted to see if there was Palestinian political organization during 1958 in Lebanon. And what I found was, and this is very shallow and not in-depth, is that the political organizations of Palestinians living in Lebanon from 1948 to 1958, there wasn't any publications that started until 1959. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that. If you're living as a refugee in Lebanon for 10 years, then in the 11th year is when you start to organize, or did it have to do with 1958?
Okay. And did you want to take? Yeah, I'll take Nate's question.
Nate, go ahead, please.
I'm sort of responding to the comments you made at the beginning of your talk about the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference and the establishment of the Algerian government in exile. And I wondered if there's a broader point to be made about the importance of the idea of the Third World in 1958, or the significance of South-South context, the way in which regional conflict is sort of internationalized in a way. Should we frame the Middle East in 1958 in terms of the idea of the Third World, as opposed to, say, an Anglo-American frame or a Cold War frame?
All right. Okay, I'll try to remember the questions and answer them with some degree of cogency, although I'll also try to do it briefly. So the first question is about, I guess, the role of oil in this reading of Arab nationalism. Now, one interesting development to emerge in the summer and fall of 1958 is a series of U.S. foreign policy documents that refine the definition of U.S. strategic interests in the Middle East. And one new thing about that set of documents is that there's a stronger effort to distinguish among different interests and to prioritize them. And essentially, it's a way of trying to live with Arab nationalism. And one point that comes through is that the kind of Arab nationalism that Nasser represents does not in itself, I mean, it could take later forms that do this, but does not in itself threaten the U.S. access to Middle Eastern oil. And also there was, because of what was happening in late 58 and early 59, there was a reading of Nasser's brand of Arab nationalism as not in itself threatening to bring the Soviet Union more deeply into the region. So because of that different articulation of U.S. interests, you see a way of American officials deciding that they can actually tolerate Nasser in ways that they hadn't believed it was possible previously. Now, this whole, the idea of invincibility versus, anything can happen. Now, I can certainly imagine how commentators in the Arab world, opinion leaders in the Arab world, would have
imagined that the United States was invincible and that it could snap its fingers and cause governments to fall and all that sort of thing. And obviously that perception persists to this day. Now we can debate about the reality, and there are many instances in which the United States does not achieve its objectives, but does still manage to change the reality on the ground in ways that are extremely destructive for the people who live there. So, the United States may be failing utterly to achieve its objectives, but still having a huge impact. So that is definitely a reality. But if you look at how the Eisenhower administration saw its position in the Middle East, and in particular the Arab world, in the late spring and early summer of 1958, you don't get the sense, a feeling of invincibility at all. Instead, you get confusion, apprehension, frustration, a sense that no matter what, as Dulles said, no matter what we do, we're damned. So that's how I would answer that question. Now, as to whether the late 1950s can be reconfigured as a moment in which the Cold War is becoming much more central in the perception of international actors, I would say definitely yes. I mean, the language of the Third World was not being used, at least not widely. I think the French were using it to some extent by this time. But definitely this rhetoric of the Afro-Asian nations and the kind of mystique that phrase evoked. And increasingly among people in the diaspora who themselves had some connection to the countries of the Afro-Asian world. So obviously African Americans are really starting to catch on to this drama of the emerging Afro-Asian nations and seeing that as a hopeful development in its own right, decolonization and so forth, but also as something that would give them leverage at home. I mean, the whole Mary Dujak argument about Cold War civil rights, that the stronger voice that the Third World gets, the stronger its voice gets, the more it's able to shape events in the United States. So, as I tried to show, that it goes beyond the Afro-Asian sphere in Latin American countries, that traditionally U.S. officials had tended to see them as very much under U.S. jurisdiction, and in the sense, often in a benign sense. Well, they're our friends. That we're their big brothers. They look to us to leadership. That is increasingly undermined by the late 50s, and there's a greater tendency, and I think this is where this notion of Third World of a later generation that encompasses Latin America and links it to the rest of the global South comes from. You start to see that new configuration emerging in the late 1950s.
Great, so let's take another round. President Sahoudi.
Just one factual correction, actually, about the idea that there was no Palestinian writing. I think if you go to our archives, you'll see that George Habash and Wadi Haddad graduated from here in the early 1950s. They're very active writers, already with the idea of, with an involving sense of not just Palestinian identity, but resistance. That's very well documented here. So that writing, actually, if you want to trace it, goes all the way back to 1949. Here, not just at AUB, but in Lebanon, they develop a press. There's correspondence clearly between here, Lebanon, and their office, as part of the Arab League, which has a Tannous leading the negotiations. So I just think that's factually wrong.
But thank you for raising that too, because it reminds me that I did not answer that question. So let me just do that. There was a reason why I said at the very end that the militant stirrings on the Palestinian side have an origin in 1958, and it's in this sense. Okay, you have, in the months preceding the Suez War, you see this phenomenon where
Palestinian groups in Gaza under Egyptian leadership and with a combination of Egyptian encouragement and restraint are making raids into Israel. The Suez War basically puts an end to that, right? Because the Israelis occupy Gaza. They don't leave until UN forces have been deployed there, and the United States has made a pledge essentially to guarantee Israeli shipping through the Strait of Tiran, and that's sort of the broader penumbra of that pledge is that the Gaza will be kept free of Palestinian militant groups. So those operations are shut down, in large part, mainly by the Egyptian government. And this is a deeply disturbing and frustrating development for those Palestinian groups. So you start seeing some new thinking about what the next phase should be. And even though 1959 is the year that Fatah is formed, 1958 is the year in which the main contacts and to some extent the writings that are published in 1959 are produced, largely in Kuwait. So 1958 is a really fascinating year for the evolution of Palestinian militancy.
So let's take another round of questions and comments. Another round of questions and comments.
I've silenced them. There we go.
Got it.
No more questions about oil companies. I don't know anything about oil.
So I agree with the point about 1959 being the key year for the Palestinian, the emergence of a separate Palestinian nationalism. And I think the president was wrong to look at Wadi Haddad and George Habash as precursors because they were talking as Arab nationalists and pan-Arabists. The interesting point would be, was this connected with the rise of Qasim as well? Because Qasim and the Algerian Revolution were actually supplying a different radical model from Nasser, where you now have a kind of Watani-based or nation-state-based radicalism, which separates slightly from the pan-Arab vision which Nasser had adumbrated. And of course, once Qasim launches this idea of a Palestinian entity in 59, it also attracts the Mufti and starts up a whole different pattern.
That's an extremely intriguing line of inquiry about which I have nothing to say. Just that I encourage people, and perhaps myself, to investigate that to see if there's anything to it.
Questions, comments? We still have less than 20 minutes, so I'd encourage you to use this excellent time to raise a few comments, ask a few questions, or...
We can also, we can do it informally over coffee, too.
If you, Syrian, do you still have coffee outside? Or did they they packed everything? Okay.
We can just do it informally. Oh, here's another question.
Great, there's a question. You saved the day again. Great.
More informal question. Would you be willing to give commentary on the recent developments in the American congressional debates that are being sort of raised by the comments of Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and sort of where would you fit that into the evolution of the American political relationship with Israel, but also the American political, particularly congressional views of the Israeli-Palestinian debate?
Okay.
I would love to hear your commentary.
That's a really fascinating question, and in some ways an explosive one. But I'll, Oh, are we collecting or?
If we have more questions, Michael, go ahead. We're collecting.
If you're collecting, I might as well throw something in. It's not quite on 58, the question, but in a way it's derived from 58. Could you enlighten us a little bit more on the American role in overthrowing the United Arab Republic, which of course was established in 58? I mean, this is an interesting moment, and as you said, it's like the Syrian crisis. It's not often covered very much, and I'm just interested in your perspective on that.
Okay.
Essentially, the coup that removed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fadi?
Since Michael asked that about secession in '61, I'm wondering also about the American position on the Ba'ath after '63. I've just read
Wait, American position on the what of 63?
on the Ba'ath Party.
Oh, the Ba'ath, yeah.
The Ba'ath in Syria. I don't
Yes.
know if in Iraq too.
Oh, in Syria or Iraq?
No,
Or
in
both?
Syria. In Syria, but maybe
Okay.
Iraq too, because as far as I've read in some of the British documents, there were sort of talks with the Baathists in Damascus after '63, perhaps maybe trying to inquire who are these people and what are they thinking. So if you can maybe add something about the American position when they took power.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know very much about those latter two questions, to be honest with you. I have not heard or read anything, and I should caution you that I have not done primary research in this area either, anything about a U.S. role in the breakup of the UAR in 1961. The impression I get is that this was seen in the Kennedy administration as not necessarily good news, because the result would be a sort of fragmentation and increased dissension within the radical camp in ways that would undermine the cooperative relationship that the Kennedy administration was trying to forge with Nasser. And in fact, that is indeed what happened. I mean, if you look at the politics of the inter-Arab politics of the early 1960s, I mean, for sure, the traditional rivalry between Arab nationalists, radicals, what have you, and conservatives, monarchists, is there. But as I said in my talk, it's overlain by this very bitter rivalry within the radical camp. And Malcolm Kerr's wonderful book, The Arab Cold War, really brings that out, often in a quite humorous way. And so obviously the breakup of the UAR, and then shortly after that, the outbreak of the Yemen War and the different controversies that swirled throughout the Arab world in the early 60s, many of which really accentuated the rivalry within the radical camp. I mean, it really could have no result other than to drive a further wedge between the United States and Egypt, and to make Kennedy's efforts to establish a rapprochement or continue a rapprochement with Egypt very difficult, if not impossible, to sustain. So there's much more one needs to learn, or that I need to learn about that. But my sense is that the breakup of the UAR was not something that the Kennedy administration would have sought, and it certainly wasn't something it welcomed. And so your question was about what contacts there may have been between the United States and Syrian Baathists in 1963? Well, the general perception is that they're better than the communists. And even if we don't have smoking gun evidence yet of a U.S. hand in the 1963 coup in Iraq, if you look at just the way, one reason why it would be on the top of the agenda would be giving an opportunity for Kennedy administration officials to say, "Phew, this is a lot better." So that would be my short take on the U.S. attitude towards the victory of the Baathists in Iraq in '63, and more generally the prospect of Baathists gaining more ascendancy vis-a-vis communists or communist sympathizing groups in Syria and elsewhere. Now, but I haven't forgotten the question about Ilhan Omar. So there are a number of things to say about the controversy, and I hope I won't just drone on too long. A couple of things is that if you look literally at what she said, it's pretty unobjectionable. There is, however, a sensitivity about the role of Jews in American public life that, as a politician, she had an obligation to be aware of. And she wasn't, and on one occasion she apologized, on another she stuck to her guns. But so I think, on balance, it was not out of line for people to question what she had said and to seek clarification. The further effort, however, to gin up a congressional resolution to condemn her was grossly disproportionate and utterly hypocritical, considering all of the other racist, bigoted things that have been tolerated in American public life prior to what she said. But one thing that's really fascinating about this whole episode is that it really shows a sea change within the Democratic Party on the Israel-Palestine issue, which at the moment does not have the ability to affect policy, but that could do so in the months or maybe the years to come. Because what happened was there was an attempt on the part of the sort of more traditional leadership of the Democratic Party, which sees, wants no daylight between itself and Israel, to produce a congressional resolution condemning her comments. And there was the expectation was this will be a cakewalk in Congress, and it wasn't. There was essentially a revolt on the part of the Democratic caucus, saying, okay, if we're going to condemn anti-Semitism, we're also going to condemn Islamophobia and racism and bigotry against LGBTQ people, and so the whole the resolution that emerged was this very broadly worded statement that didn't that actually criticized other figures in American life in ways that Omar herself was not criticized. And I think that shows the strength of this new force in the Democratic Party. Now it was coming largely from the grassroots, and there's often a pretty wide disconnect between what the most dynamic elements of a political party want and what the leadership of that party produces. And of course, the Democrats are not in control of foreign policy. But this is something to watch. And in the event that we have a Democratic administration in 2021, there could be, in some areas, let's not raise expectations too high, but there could be some changes in the U.S. approach to this issue.
So we have a question from one of our colleagues who's writing the chapter on the Soviet Union. So this is Elizabeth Bishop.
Okay.
And her question is, if you were advising graduate students interested in this field, what problematics would you consider key? And if there's a final question, we still have 10 minutes, exactly 10 minutes. So there's one pressing question. Murat, go ahead.
Thank you very much for your useful presentation, but I don't have a question, but just I will try to give a contribution to your comments about the US policy in this geography, because we are focusing on the Middle East, but let's focus on Turkey because they are all similar things. Mm-hmm. First of all, when Turkey tried to balance its relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, we see these military interventions. They didn't let Turkey to change its direction, let's say, to balance its, to normalize its relations with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. 1960, 1971, and 1980, they were not coincidence with, while we were trying to balance our relations, especially in the economic realm, all these military interventions took place in Turkey. And there are very strong indicators that the US was trying to push Turkey to stay away from the Soviet Union in these years. And maybe the second one was, you talked about the Baathists and the communists, and the Baathists were better for the United States. It was the nationalists and the Islamists in Turkey. They were better for the communists, and they supported the nationalists in the 1960s and 70s as a cure for communism, because they were afraid of losing Turkey to the communist side, but there was no such background for Turkey to falling into communist hands. Maybe I can say that at the height of its power, the Communist Party got 3% of votes in the elections. There was no such communist background, but it was used for legitimizing Turkish foreign policy in relation with the United States. And the last one, as a last comment, because I'm talking about these issues because I will not talk about these issues in my presentation tomorrow. They are not related. But what about the regimes in these countries, whether authoritarian or pro-US or pro-Soviet? This is, again, this was the fact for Turkey because one of our journalists made a conversation, made an interview with the CIA director, Stanfield Turner, in the 1970s, and he said, no matter what the regime is, but we are collaborating with regimes who are friendly with the United States, whether it's authoritarian or a military regime, and you see that Turkey's better relations were seen after these military coups in 1960 and 1980. Just for contribution for your comments about the Arab world and the US policies in this region. Okay.
To your point, there's a book that came out in 2018 by a Turkish colleague that wrote about US-supported military coups in Pakistan and Turkey.
Yeah.
Omar Aslan.
Yeah, and I wrote an article about this, the role of the United, but it's in Turkish for our promotion procedures about, but I wrote an article about this issue, the 1960, 71, and 80. Thank you very much.
Okay, so what
you advise graduate
problematics
students,
should students?
If you're advising students right now, what would be?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. Well, I mean, I think a number of the questions that I was unable to answer are definitely worthy of further exploration. For example, this Palestinian question I think is really fascinating, and there has been some really good work done on it. But I think there's a lot more that we need to learn about the emergence of sort of the reawakening of Palestinian nationalism in the late 1950s. So I would definitely say that is something that people should look into. And the kind of work that Elizabeth herself is doing, bringing this kind of transnational history where you're looking at whether you call them communist front organizations or she says Shia front organizations, throughout the communist or the Soviet world, I mean, that kind of work potentially can be really fruitful. There is a danger of picking something that's obscure and seeing that you have an opportunity to make a mark, but the key step to make after you've uncovered all of this new information and brought these previously unheard voices to our attention is to connect that to the bigger stories that we tell, and to sort of alleviate some of the so what concerns that people might have when you bring out previously obscure information. So I would say that the real challenge is to go out and find something new, but not something new just for the sake of being new. Something new and relevant. Those are the things that have to go together.
On that happy note, please join me in thanking Professor Salim for a perfect keynote. Thank you.